Welcome to my Commodore 64 Games memories. This is where I look at old games and some of the technical details behind them. Let's get into it. Today we have Armalyte, published in 1988 by Thalamus on tape and also on disc, developed by Dan Phillips and Robin Levy, and cover artwork by the late Oliver Frey. This was one of the first games that I bought with hard-earned cash from doing some programming at the time, when I should have really been studying for my exams. I distinctly remember standing in front of a wall-mounted rotary telephone like this one and chatting with someone at the Games Club mail order games service and handing over, I think, what was my dad's credit card information at the time so that they could post me a copy of this. I bought the disc version and I wasn't disappointed. It was probably one of the best purchases that I made on the Commodore 64. So let's have a quick look at the files as they are on the disk images first. This is what the first side of the disk directory structure looks like. Just extracting the files. Cannot create file, permission denied. Not surprised with that, but that's okay. So we'll have a little look. There we go. So there's this file called cyberdos, which has this little text message inside it, with a telephone number which looks like it's been blanked out. 0392, and then it's just filled with zeros. Interesting. We have a boot, and this looks like a stack slide. You can see it loads at memory address 100 in hex, compared to 326 in hex. And this fills the stack with 2, all the way up until the point at which it reaches the memory address 203, which is just after the stack, and then it will run some code there. Remember the address on the stack will try and return to there, so the stack slide is a perfectly valid way of trying to return code as you're doing the default load routine. So actually the default load routine will at some point try and escape a little bit earlier to run the code that has been loaded. The text which is visible inside that file is a little bit interesting. We can see quite early on there's a name, Martin Walker, there's demo loader 2075 Trilogic version 3.2. So we know that at some point this file was compressed or frozen with Trilogic, the hacking cartridge if you like, or the developer cartridge if you're going to be nice about it. There's this little file here which doesn't seem to do much apart from print a hello message. It looks like a standard basic program. This is not too interesting. Apart from it had the file name blocks free, which is quite funny. So now we seem to know how the disk is going to try and auto start with that stack slide. We can come prepared when we go into the emulator, and we'll probably start with an ICU. So here we are, it starts at 203. This is the first entry point that we get into after the stack slide. We can see that the memory that was loaded matches up with the memory that's in the file that we looked at. There we go, a whole bunch of 2s, and then some EAs, which are no ops, NOP opcodes, which does nothing. And then there's A900, which is load accumulator immediate with 0. And that's what we can see here in the computer's disassembly. This code does some fairly standard stuff, to be honest. We can see the stack area there filled with B, which is kind of what we expect because B is the second screen code character. I'm just setting up a label file there with just the break commands, so I can delete all the breakpoints and then restore the breakpoints to the serial routines in the kernel quite easily just by doing a label load without reloading all of the labels all over again, just by setting the breakpoints again. Makes it a bit easier, you see. So when we're at this point, just after the Commodore 64 is starting to execute the first loaded file, we can see that there's text in the block allocation map. And there's a little message there saying, but that means yes, you cannot alter the disk. Well, you still can, it's just that you can't alter it using the standard DOS commands. We can see that these buffers are used by the standard 1541 ROM routines, of course. So we have the last loaded block of file data, which is in buffer, the buffer starting at 400 in hex. We have the directory, and then we have the BAM, the block allocation map. So this kind of thing was probably put there by the person doing the disk mastering, maybe. I want to set a breakpoint in the drive's memory for trying to execute any code within the buffer space, 300 in hex to 800 in hex, just to really try and trap any drive side code which is being loaded or executed by the game as early as possible. This seems to set up the NMI service routine up at 227 with a timer. It seems to start the timer, and it seems to be jumping into some code at 227, which the code at 227, of course, is a 40 in hex opcode, which, if memory serves me correctly, is RTI, so it just does a return from interrupt straight away. The RTI instruction is actually knopped out. You can see at 226 there's an 80, which is a 2-byte NOP immediate in this case. There's a little message there saying that the boot file is by MB. I wonder who MB is. We might find out if we keep on digging into the code for this disk boot. Quite early on we can see that we're doing some standard kernel routines, or calling some standard kernel routines. I'm going to delete all of the breakpoints there. So after the load has completed, it comes to this knocked out C2. Okay, but then there's some weird extended or undefined opcodes, which, to be honest, don't seem to do much. It does store AX into 1FF, so it does set up some information into 1FF, which is probably in preparation, almost certainly in preparation for the indirected jump at 2,4D, which is a jump with indirected jump to 1FF. Because we have a nice debugging monitor here, I'm not going to spend too much brain power into trying to find out where that is going to go. We can see that some code has been loaded, and some data as well, of course. But what's the purpose of those undocumented opcodes? Well, it's probably just to really confuse people, to try and fool them into thinking that something weird is going on, and to obfuscate the code execution pathway a little bit. Doesn't stop us, of course, because we can see straight away that it executes code at C240 when we step into it in the debugger, which is not a problem. The LAX, the load accumulator, and X at the same time with 1FF is probably there just to, again, obfuscate the entry point for the code. So looking through this code, we can see that it's doing a load, X with C000. It's doing a set name with one character, and that character is located at 101 in hex, which is 2. F51C, if you remember, is the store indirected y with AE and AF as a low and high byte in the standard kernel load function. So I'm just putting a break here just to see where the first store from the load arrives. C000 in hex. Not a surprise here. So there's no surprising disk file redirection by rewriting AE or AF, for example, like one of the other loaders was doing, which was really quite something special. This is just doing a normal file load. High up in memory in C000, which is the spare memory, if you like, between the basic kernel and the real kernel, in between the memory space in between the basic and the IO space, which is at D000 in hex. So we know that all of this memory has been loaded from that file on disk, just standard stuff. What does the code do? So it finishes at C500. Okay. So anyway, we have this obfuscated code flow, but we can see it's doing a load, or not, store. And then it does a dex, and branching on equal and goes around. So it is slightly descrambling or yeah, descrambling I would say. Obviously because he's just doing a straight EOR, there's no real decryption or anything. 2 pages, C0 and C1, 00 in hex. We have another NOP, just keeps on doing this. There's no real surprise about what it is doing. We're just going to put a breakpoint here. We know that we're going to get to that point. There, see? No problem at all. So what else is this doing? Well, this is now loading the X register with 3F. So it looks like it's now doing the first 40 in hex, so 64 bytes in decimal of the memory page at C200. So it's not quite self-modifying itself, but it is descrambling some code at the start of the memory page in which this descramble code is running. And then at the end you can see it does another NOP, and at this time with an absolute address which does nothing practically. And then it does a JSR. It does a JSR to C000. The JSR may or may not return. It depends on what the code does, of course, right? We haven't had a look at that yet. But anyway, this is just cycling around. We can see that it's changing the data there. EOR with 2, 55555. Right. As long as 2, the memory address 2 has the correct data inside it, then this code will succeed. And then it just does the JSR here. It does a branch not equal, and then look, there's a little jump to FCE2. FCE2, if you remember, is going to be the kernel reset routine. We hope it avoids that. Now, this code here does a whole bunch of serial bus. Oh, look, there's a little message in the memory. You might be able to see that there. Yeah, there we go. Data duplication disk protection system by Mike Brown. Mike Brown, the initials MB. There we go, see? So boot by MB, so probably Mike Brown is taking credit for authoring the boot system. And the data duplication disk protection system is also by Mike Brown, so okay, we'll note down that name later on. So you can see here that it's doing a few JSRs and then an RTS. Interesting. It's loading with C0B9, which I think is going to turn out to be interesting later on. So the labels help us to understand what this is doing, so we can see it's sending a listen with the second data address. It's sending deferred data, so it's sending 4D2D57 from memory. This looks like it's probably doing an m-w command, and it's sending the m-w command to the drive. It looks like it's sending a few commands to the drive, perhaps. Look, it's doing some initialization here. Interestingly, it's doing an open without a name, and then it's sending more characters, so it's doing a different way of sending a command to the drive. It's doing an MR, which is a memory read, rather than a memory write command. So it looks like it's sending a memory write command and then a memory read in 2 different ways. One with quite low level serial routines, and then one with a more high level structured standard kernel entry. So I don't know why the person who wrote this is deciding to do it in 2 different ways. If they are already using the lower level serial routines and sending bytes directly, then why are they using the higher level kernel routines? It might just be a little bit of obfuscation, perhaps. Or maybe it was written at 2 different points in time and they just didn't update all of the pieces of code. That may also be true. Yes, they're using the memory read command with the higher level kernel standard routines for doing an open, so perhaps they're sending the memory read and then expecting to read data using the higher level stuff. So maybe they didn't want to worry too much about using the lower level flow control commands. So it's doing this code first of all. This code seems to do a whole bunch or block of memory write commands, and now this code here we're going to have a look at later on, where it uses the higher level, more standard kernel entry points here for doing an open and sending some bytes and then reading some bytes with a memory read command. We'll have a look at that in more detail after. So we can see there is a 4D, 2D, 5, 7. So 4D in PETSCII is M, 2D is the dash or minus sign in PETSCII, and then 5.7 is W in PETSCII. So yes, it's definitely sending the M-W command to the drive. And page 38 in the 1541 user guide confirms. We can see from the CPU history that this kernel entry point is coming from the loaded code from the game at C022. We can see that the low and high address to store this data in the disk is coming from the two 0-page registers or addresses 5 and 6. We can see that it's sending 20 in hex number of bytes, which is 32 bytes at a time, and it's sending this information, which is here at 3 and 4 in hex, which is indirected, y, which is this data here, which just basically looks like a whole bunch of code. It's then sending an unlisten. It's advancing the 0-page addresses at 3 and 4, and that's at memory address C057, the code there, and it's advancing it by 32, doing a carry check and incrementing 4. Then it's sending the next bunch of 32 bytes, or 20 in hex bytes. It's doing that a few times. It then sends an unlisten, telling the drive that we're finished with that. At the point it's finished the unlisten, the drive will go off and process those. Well, it's already been processing the commands. We can actually see it's doing a little unscramble there by doing an EOR with 0.5 in a hex at memory address C049 in the code there. A very simple piece of obfuscation, nothing too complicated. So we can see it's definitely loaded some code inside one of the buffers, starting at 500 in hex on the drive side. This sets up another command, M-E this time. This is memory execute rather than memory write, and it executes with the low and the high address of 0 and 5, so that's 500, which we know now is that we're telling, or rather the game code is telling the drive to start executing its code at 500 in hex inside its own memory. Don't forget the 1541 is a computer in its own right. It has input-output peripherals control. Obviously it controls the disk motor and disk head and data reading and stuff like that, and also writing. It has a CPU and memory inside, so it's a fully fledged computer. We can see it's got a whole bunch of stuff there. So this is interesting. It says protected and duplicated by data duplication, written by Kevin Parker. Now that name, Kevin Parker, is different. This was in the decrypted data, or I'm not going to say crypted, descrambled data, descrambled using that very simple EOR. So, that's interesting. Why is the name different to the one that's used as a credit for the boot file? Okay. So we can see there, look, Mike Brown. Mike Brown claims credit there, but then in the descrambled data sent to the disk, the name is different. So, if you know Mike Brown or Kevin Parker, or if you are Mike Brown or Kevin Parker, I think it was, reading or watching this video and reading this text, I was wondering if they would be able to explain why is there this discrepancy, right? Who really wrote and who really protected this data on this disk? Was it Mike Brown, or was it Kevin Parker, or was it both of them? Did Kevin do the drive code and Mike Brown do the Commodore 64 side of the code? If you know, then kindly put the answer in the comments section below. I'm always interested to hear from people mentioned in this old code found by digging along in the memory. I had a very nice chat with somebody, I think it was from the last Ninja video, when I found their name. I think it was in the tape protection code or something like that. It was a lovely conversation. So I would be really interested to hear from Mike or Kevin. Anyway, so I'm really interested in this code that executes and opens the file and then sends what looks like the memory read and then reads in some bytes. So this is just after the memory execute has been sent by the Commodore 64 to the drive, but the drive hasn't started executing its drive code yet. We can see the drive is still running around in its ROM, standard ROM code. Here we are, the Commodore 64 is doing some standard kernel stuff. In this version of Vice, CPU history is only, I think, for the Commodore 64 side of code. It's not showing the CPU history for the drive execution, if I remember correctly. Yes, look at the stack pointer. The stack pointer is way up. I don't think the drive ever gets the stack pointer that high. The drive has a lower stack pointer because it uses some other parts of that address space for other data. So anyway, the Commodore 64 backtrace goes back to C088. The drive still hasn't started executing its drive code yet. It will do, because we've got a breakpoint there. The code on the drive of 5AF and 5B2 looks like it's returning either FF or 0, either success or fail. I think this is the end of the protection check. I think the drive code is running some sector reading stuff, and it looks like it's checking values. If we have a look at there we go, it's doing a memory read. So actually it's reading back data from the disk. It's sending the MR command, which is memory read, and it is then sending a low high address of B75, which is 5B7 in hex. So it's trying to read probably 1 byte, but maybe more than 1 byte, from the disk memory at 5B7. So at the moment, 5B7, it's actually contained at C2. So at this point in the code, when it's doing the memory read, it's obviously executed the code in the drive already at 500 in hex inside its own internal buffer, and it's returned, and the protection check has returned back this value, or it's going to return back this value of C2, right, by doing this memory read command. Now, first of all, it's doing a char out, so it's sending the memory read command, it's clearing the channel, it's setting the channel for input, and then it's doing a char in, and then it's clearing the channels again. And then doing a close, and then a close all, blah, 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 clear all, or something like that. So look, it's doing a char in, CHRIN, kernel side on the Commodore 64, and then it's storing the result in C0B9. At the moment, C0B9 is 0. So we're expecting C2 from the drive memory to be returned with the memory read command, and then C2 to be stored in C0B9. Now the drive side code seems to be, let's see, C100, that's probably turning on the LED. Looks like it's doing a sector read. Looks like it's trying 2 sector reads. I think one C01 is a byte from the disk read head. I'll check that in a bit. The code at 58C in the disk side is doing a compare with various different values. 5B2 returns 0 and 58F returns 1, so okay. We'll just double check this. So chart out, you can see writes byte to default output, blah blah blah. Clear chart in is clear channel is close the default input output files, blah blah blah. Restore default input output, right? And then it's doing a chkin, which defines the file as input. So yes, the stream, the file handle, if you like, is now set to be input, and then it's doing a chrin, which is different to chkin. I know it's quite difficult to see in that small text, but they are different. Chrin is read byte from default input. The default input is set by the open. Okay, so the default input is not the keyboard, it is the disk. And it's storing that result of getting that character into C0B9, which is read by this memory read. So it looks like the drive is returning something on success. Yeah, data to or from the drive head is at 1C01 in the drive memory mapping, the IO space memory mapping. That's when the drive code finishes executing there. Just does a nice, simple and safe RTS, because it's being told to do that from the memory execute command, right? And then it's returning from the memory execute command, and it does that cleanly because it has to respond to then a follow-up memory read command, which is coming from the Commodore 64 and sent to the 1541 drive. There we go. The accumulator has the value of C2 and it's going to get stored into C0B9. We can see on the drive side of things it's returned back to its standard ROM calls, because we can see it's running code from the ROM address space. I'm going to watch on a load and store for C0B9. I want to see when that's accessed next. Just going to run the code now. That's the store that we've just done after reading the character from the input file. Excuse me. And there we go, the RTS is done. So after running all of that kernel serial code that accesses the drive, it just does a simple load and then an RTS, and the RTS then sends us back to this kind of like obfuscated code flow. We can see here that if it's not equal, it skips over the jump with FCE2, which is reset, and then it does some final looks like descrambling, but this time doing an EOR with C2, which is immediate. Okay, so the funny thing is that I would have thought that this code would have done an EOR with the returned C2 rather than doing an EOR with immediate C2. Right? If you descramble with a data byte returned back from the disk, then it's a little bit better protection code, to be honest. So it doesn't seem to check the value returned from the drive, except to check if it's equal or if it's 0 or not 0. It doesn't check the actual real value. It doesn't seem to anyway. FCE2, we can just double check there is the reset routine. Yes. You know, I should really flag that FCE2 as a label in the kernel as the reset routine, but I don't know why that is. So we'll just rewind a little bit back to just before the drive was going to execute its first bunch of code at 500. We just really want to have a quick little look through the code here. I just wanted to double check some of the code which is being called. So C100, yes, we can see C100 in that code, in the drive code, in the kernel, drives ROM routines, is turn on LED. It's then going to D6, JSR to D6, D3, which is at 527 in this disassembly of the drive code. D6, D3, C100, we know what that is. D6, D3, what's that? Does anyone remember what D6, D3 is? Set track and sector. Transmit parameter to the disk controller. Okie dokie. So it's, okay, so it's, alright, track number, sector number, drive number. Okay, that's no problem. So it looks like it's doing a track and sector read. It's then doing a load with 3 and then a branch on minus, so it looks like it's waiting for the command to return. before doing the RTS at 543. So it does the code. It runs the code first of all at 517 with the JSR. You can see there at 50A. It runs this code to looks like it reads the tracking sector, waits for it to complete. It then looks like it does the self-modifying code at 50D, which self-modifies the 5B5 and 530. 5B5 and 530. 530 is the load. Yep. So it looks like it's setting up a different tracking sector to read, and it looks like it's doing this. It's falling through and doing this code again, and then it finally completes and does the RTS. So it reads, looks like it reads two tracking sectors differently, and then returns. Okay, no problem at all. So yeah, these are the 0-page addresses for the drive internals. No problem there. Yada yada yada. Drive code, standard kernel. ROM routines for the drive. This is the command. You see, it just reads to see when the command's finished by checking for while it's minus, then keep on looping around. Otherwise, if it's plus, it indicates that the command has finished, you see. The Commodore 64 is in the middle of its standard kernel routines for doing serial communication. We can see that Commodore 64 is going to go back to that C088 code that we were looking at just now. Don't forget, at the moment we're mostly having a look at what the drive code has been doing. This is where the Commodore 64 then will start doing its memory read command in a bit, but it won't be doing that just quite yet, especially since the drive is running the drive code that was memory executed. Right? We now know what this code does, we understand it, okay? We know that the drive is going to return that byte, indicating whether or not it succeeded or not. The drive is now doing its RTS. Now we can see that at 543 on the drive disassembly, it's going to do its RTS, which then goes back to here, which is, I think, what looks like the second sector read now that the drive is going to be doing. There we go. And then after the second sector read, and there we go, it's read that byte again from the drive side of the code. So this code, once it passes what looks like the initial drive protection check, it does this last descramble, which descrambles 2 pages at C3 and C4 on the Commodore 64 side of things. So we have a whole bunch of stuff. We've got what looks like the file name cyberdos, that looks familiar, right? And we've got some code A9 0B, load accumulator immediate with 0B, store in the screen control, set LFS, set name, load, la. Sets up some vectors, maybe sets up the vectors so that they are returned back to their default values, perhaps. 11 high address, 6CE3, okay. And then 2 and 3 is FEDE, okay, well, alright. It's doing, alright, well, we'll it's doing an execute next statement, okay. It's doing a basic tail new CLR init stack, A533, okay. To be honest, we'll double check this, but I think what it's doing is that it's trying to load cyberdos, the cyberdos file. I mean, look, it's doing 300 and 302, right? Excuse me. I'm always a little bit suspicious when somebody starts tweaking these vectors down at 300 and 302 in hex, and then doing a whole bunch of basic initialization stuff. You see, it's doing a set name with C400. C400 is cyberdos. This is the data that was loaded from the drive. That was the drive's buffer memory, which is what it reads into and then decodes all of the GCR data and stuff from the disk and stuffs it in there. We're going to put a break at 100 to 800 on the Commodore 64 side, just to really see what it's doing with those vectors. You see, I'm suspicious of this now. It's got all the way to this point. There's nothing there at 800. There's a whole bunch of code that was loaded from the cyberdos file there, and you can see here, look, it's going into 334. the way that it did that is that it went out of the char out routine, then it went to 326, da 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 da. So yeah, a little bit of obfuscation there about how it's loading what file and how it's actually executing it, but actually it's not that obfuscated. So 78A9 6E load accumulator immediate with 6E in hex, blah blah blah. SEI 78 in hex is obviously stop interrupts. It's the code starting at 334. We know that because that's where the breakpoint came in. The weird thing here is that it's reading it's doing a send listen, and it's loading accumulator with BA from the 0 page. So BA, I think, is the last device used, which is 8. But all of the protection code check just seemed to assume that drive was 8. So it looks like it was a different person that wrote this. Okay, so I think this is the cyberdos file, right? So whoever wrote this cyberdos file, I have a feeling it's Dan Phillips, is nicely using the correct 0 page memory address for the last device, but the protection check doesn't. We can see here that it seems to be sending more memory write commands. It seems to be sending data from 500 in hex in a loop, blah blah blah. So this is all after the protection check code is completed. I bet that's a memory execute after doing a whole bunch of memory writes. Yep. So it was then, after all of the disk commands were finished, it was then, you can see there, look, it's reading the serial port. It's doing an and then a store, and then an or, and then a store. So it's into A5 and A4. So it's setting up some optimized values for what the bits should be in the serial port. So it doesn't have to do the anding and the oring and storing later on. It can do a more optimized version, which is again the nice way of doing it, as opposed to assuming what the bits should be and doing immediate stores. Here again, I'm just really re-noticing that MB is Mike Brown. Anyway, so then it is doing a set interrupt. So here I think we can assume that we're loading into the drive some turbo code, and it's going to start doing what looks like a 2-bit transfer protocol, I bet. Because, you know, one of the reasons why you would want to calculate or pre-calculate the bits to send to your serial routine is that you really want to have a very fast routine for reading and tweaking bits. You want to waste as little time as possible. So this just relocates some of the code higher up into screen memory, the default screen memory at 600 hex. Don't know why it would do that, but okay. And look, here is what we have. So we have storing into the serial port, waiting for a reply from the drive, storing more data into the serial port. So it says, I'm ready to send, the Commodore 64 says, I'm ready to send data. Are you ready, drive? And yes. And then you're ACKing or acknowledging the drive's acknowledgement of you. That's what it looks like there. There's a little decrement and increment of the border color, which takes some time, but not very much, but it's a useful visual clue that something is being done on the drive side. Here we go, the drive is loading, or the drive is running drive side code now. So the drive will get the query from the Commodore 64. It will then send back an acknowledgement, and it will wait for the acknowledgement, of course, from the Commodore 64. So it will wait for the Commodore 64's ACK. Da, 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 da. And then we can see here the code at 455 on the Commodore 64 side matches, look, it's doing 1, 2, 3, 4 serial port reads, and then it indirects it with some tables, and then it does an ORs, and then store. So it's storing a byte, or at least it's reading a byte and returning it at the RTS at 46D, and of course a byte is 8 bits, and there are 4 chunks, so it's 2 bits per chunk. So it's a 2-bit transfer protocol. It's doing a check here. Yep. So it's doing a check with some of the returned values. Might be doing an error check or something like that. Anyway, it's then doing a indirected store. Indirected store is pretty much a guarantee that it's doing an indirected store, and it's even doing an indirected store with AE and AF. So AE and AF are the standard kernel load routine indirect addresses, and it's doing another one here too, which is vaguely intriguing, but okay. So it might be loading two files perhaps. Either way, we'll bring up the memory view. We'll shrink down this now and we'll have a look to see what the emulator's doing. I think that jump at 416 to 81B in hex is on the Commodore 64 disassembly is going to be the final jump. I have a feeling. Interesting you might want to know here is that it starts doing an indirected store back to FF, which is way up at the top of memory underneath the kernel ROM. And you can see here that when the Commodore 64 finishes reading a byte, the drive code has finished sending the byte. We can see that the drive code is paired so that it does this 2-bit store back to its serial port back to the Commodore 64. Yeah, this is standard 2-bit protocol transfer stuff, apart from this first store is storing at the very end of memory and then looping back to the beginning of memory. I wonder if these MBs are the initials of MB here for the boot file. I'm wondering that. Maybe not. We'll see. Maybe it's just coincidence. Anyway, it seems to be loading a whole bunch of stuff all over memory. So it seems to be loading a couple of chunks maybe. Okay, well, one way of doing it. Looks like it's doing a skip or something like that maybe. Anyway, it does some more stores. It's still storing, look. Still going up through memory, 9FCD now in hex. X register seems to be a counter or length or something like that, or the number of blocks left. And then it's doing a jump with 81B right at the end. 81B contains code, quite a bit of code. There seems to be a whole bunch of blanked out data at the beginning of the memory. This is the Armalyte file that was on the disk, so it's just loading the standard Armalyte file on the disk at the correct memory address, skipping some data or something like that. Maybe it's not quite loading all of the file, or I don't know. Anyway, so it looks like it's loading that file into memory in some chunks, 2 chunks maybe. Doesn't look like all of the memory is written to, of course. And there we go. Here's that excellent disk menu that I really liked seeing when I got this disk version and I first ran it. I really liked seeing the disk games have extra bonus material on them. I think it was quite lovely that they would include extra bonus material, like, say for example, the loading picture, and in this case it's Walker's Warbles, which is a music demo from Martin Walker, who did the music and the sound effects, I think, for this game. Yeah, music and sound effects, if I remember rightly. We can see here, actually, that the text on this screen is really quite interesting. So you'll notice that it's reversed text. And actually in the view here, it's not rendering correctly, and that's because it's using extended color mode. Again, extended high-res text mode, which is where actually the background color registers are being used for the text. That's how we're able to get this very colorful high-resolution text by updating the different background colors. But it reduces the amount that is used in the character set. This screen mode was actually used in Manic Miner, if you remember. But in this case, it's using it so that it can have differently moving and different colored raster bar effects in different portions of the same horizontal character line. And this screen being reversed is going to be like foreshadowing, if you like, for the game, actually, because if I remember correctly, the game character set for the levels is actually reversed as well, which allows the artist, Robin Levy in this case, to use extra colors during the game. Have a better choice of colors, what colors to use, basically. Black is black, so they wanted to use the background color. So let's have a look at this title screen in the C64 debugger, because it does render extended character set information correctly, and we can see here how the screen, this is the proper screen, the Commodore 64 screen is in the top right, but the larger screen here that I'm moving the cursor over allows us to see what registers are being updated at what cycle position as the VIC raster position is moved up and down the screen. We can see that it's using the high resolution extended character set mode, and we can see how the different registers at D021, D022 and D023 especially are being updated in synchronization with the raster. So we're getting these individual raster bar effects for the extended character set mode. This actually allows up to 3 individual colors to be set and color cycled, which is really quite cool, right? Because the text, I think, is in reverse mode. So here we have the disk load. So this is this flipped disk message and then load level data. Which is standard multicolor text mode. There's nothing unusual about that whatsoever. Now this lovely title screen, when I first saw it, it really blew my socks off. I really loved the obviously multiplexed sprites swirling around. I would watch this title screen and listen to it for a very long time. Because the music by Martin Walker is fantastic, but also the graphical effects are lovely to watch. So you can see here, if I go into the VIC mode, you can see what are the individual sprites. There are 24 of them. If I pause the emulation, it'll be easier to count, I think, but you can see the multicolored text in the background. We can see actually that the ship, the starfield indicator in the bottom right hand corner, and the player type, the ship type in the bottom left, and also the text in the background is all just multicolored screen, because there are no red boxes surrounding them, so it's obvious that they're not sprites. And we can see there's a little message there saying "Hello Hacker" in the character set. Thank you very much. Very funny. Not hacker, just someone doing a YouTube channel, which probably, obviously, when this game was published, YouTube definitely did not exist. Obviously. There were no real web browsers back in, 1988? Not really. Many people did not have home internet back in 1988. I only got dial-up internet back in 94, 96, something like that, when I first started work. So, using the debugger here, we can see how the sprite pointers are updated with the multiplexer. We can also see, so as I move the mouse pointer up and down to sample what's happening at the VIC, you can see that the screen background color and the 2 multicolors are being updated, especially for the Armalyte logo, but also for some of the text. We can see what are multiplexed sprites, and we can also see the score panel in the bottom border using the sprites too. Back to the disk menu quickly for the game. If we have a look at the loading picture, we can see it just does a whole bunch of memory moving and copying around. And then we get the loading picture and the lovely music. The rest of the memory seems to be quite clear, doesn't it? Very clear, in fact. I think that looks like the music routine. page addresses. When I was younger, I loved this music demo. It was a nice little peek into Martin Walker's composition style for the music. It also showed very well how his music player routine was nice and small and neat and quite well optimized. One last little thing I think from the disk version is that when it's loading the level data, let's have a quick little look. There we go, G-code monitor, and we can see here the Commodore 64 is doing a load with D012, which is, does anyone remember what D012 is? It is the VIC2 raster position. So what it's doing is that, again, it seems to be doing the 2-bit protocol transfer here that we saw during the initial game load, but before it does the transfer, we can see it's doing more no ops. It's not incrementing or decrementing the border color this time, so we're not seeing white flashing bars on the screen. What we are seeing is that the screen is on, and it's doing a comparison with the raster position, and it's only telling the byte, it's only telling the drive to send the next byte from the Commodore 64 side when the Commodore 64 is not going to be encountering what's known as a bad line in the VIC. So most other lines, apart from the line at the beginning of the character row, the processor is not stalled that much. However, when the screen is on, every 8 raster lines, every 8 pixels for one 8-pixel high character row, there are more cycles stolen from the 6502 and given to the VIC processor. So we don't want to be trying to do any very tightly timed drive code updates when it's doing a bad line, so this is why it avoids the bad lines. This is actually a much earlier example of the kind of 2-bit protocol that I've been working on for my own drive code, but that actually does 2 bytes transfer per character. But it does the same kind of thing. It knows what are the bad it knows what a bad raster position is, to not even consider requesting a byte from the disk. It only requests the byte when it's safe to do so, and this does the same kind of thing. The comparison with $31 in hex is basically saying if it's up at the top of the screen or if it's inside the vertical borders, then you can just request a byte straight away. It doesn't matter, and then it only checks for the bad lines here. There we go. Cool, right? So yeah, this is doing a 2-bit protocol transfer for the level data. After loading the level data, it seems to do a decompression, as you would normally expect. We can see here it's standard multicolored mode. So we can see here, actually, it seems to be doing progressive reads as the level scrolls. Now the level is scrolling in the background, it's just scrolling on empty data. You can see it's marching across this memory range. It also seems to do a whole bunch of reads very, very quickly as it moves in the level. It seems when you go from the title screen to starting the game or doing this demonstration mode, the easiest way to fill the whole screen is actually just to call the level render functions very, very quickly and just scroll on 40 characters worth or a screen width's worth of data. Let's fill in those memory addresses on the Commodore 64 side, and we can see, look, if we go back now, we've changed the level map for what comes on the screen when the level demonstration starts. And I think obviously you can see here that when the game starts it reuses that data, so we have updated the level map. So there we go, we can see how the decompressed level map is actually used within the game's memory as it's running, which is kind of interesting. We can again see that the the game uses this reversed mode, so that gives an extra free colour, if you like, by reusing the background colour. It increases the range of colours that can be used during the game. You can use things like light blue, which you would never really be able to do because you can't use that as a multicolour primary, the multicolour primary colour. I mean, you could certainly use it as an extended colour for one of the two multicolours, but this just gives you more freedom in the colour choice that you can use during the game, especially since the level doesn't rely on character colouring for its graphics. And of course, if you go back to the title screen, it uses a different pattern for the balls each time, which I thought was fantastic as well. It looked really, really nice. So let's have a little quick look at the tape version as well, because Thalamus and Kicks, but we'll have a look at just the Thalamus version, I think. There we go, cyberload, now loading. We have the standard cyberload message. Now loading Armalyte. 9 0 1 2 3 4 5 6. Okay. Now this is interesting. On the Commodore 64, there's no third line, but on the debug text view, we can see uncredited programming and games design by John Harris. I didn't see John Harris's name in the disk version anywhere, so I'm guessing John Harris must have done the tape mastering and inserted his name, for whatever reason, into just the tape version of Armalyte. I bet there's a whole story there, which I'm not really going to comment on, to be honest. But anyway, we can see that there's a whole bunch of loader code up at C000. Hackers, F off and die, blah blah blah, and then the uncredited games, blah blah blah. So yeah, there we go. That was Armalyte. Of course, we have the loading screen on the tape version with this wonderful music. We can see actually that the loaded data coming through from the tape is actually compressed with Trilogic version 3.2, which is the expert cartridge, right? So anyway, the person who did the tape mastering obviously did a final compression pass with Trilogic. So I think we'll leave that video there. Thank you very much for watching these technical deep dive videos, and if you like what you see, then please do consider liking or subscribing to this channel, or adding a comment in the comment section below. I really do like hearing from people. So thank you very much. Take care, have a great day, wherever you are.